Chapter 9. My father's death and my double shame. The time of which I am now speaking is my 16th year. My father, as we have seen, was bedridden, suffering from a fistula. My mother, an old servant of the house, and I were his principal attendants. I had the duties of a nurse, which mainly consisted in dressing the wound, giving my father his medicine, and compounding drugs whenever they had to be made up at home. Every night I massaged his legs and retired only when he asked me to do so or after he had fallen asleep. I loved to do this service. I do not remember ever having neglected it. All the time at my disposal after the performance of the daily duties was divided between school and attending on my father. I would only go out for an evening walk either when he permitted me or when he was feeling well. This was also the time when my wife was expecting a baby, a circumstance which, as I can see today, meant a double shame for me. For one thing, I did not restrain myself as I should have done whilst I was yet a student. And secondly, this carnal lust got the better of what I regarded as my duty to my parents, Shravan having been my ideal since childhood. Every night whilst my hands were busy massaging my father's legs, my mind was hovering about the bedroom, and that too at a time when religion, medical science, and common sense alike forbade sexual intercourse. I was always glad to be relieved from my duty and went straight to the bedroom after doing obeisance to my father. At the same time, my father was getting worse every day. Ayurvedic physicians had tied all their ointments, hakims their plasters, and local quacks their nostrums. An English surgeon had also used his skill. As the last and only resort, he had recommended a surgical operation. But the family physician came in the way. He disapproved of an operation being performed at such an advanced age. The physician was competent and well-known, and his advice prevailed. The operation was abandoned, and various medicines purchased for the purpose were of no account. I have an impression that, if the physician had allowed the operation, the wound would have been easily healed. The operation also was to have been performed by a surgeon who was then well known in Bombay. But God had willed otherwise. When death is imminent, who can think of the right remedy? My father returned from Bombay with all the paraphernalia of the operation, which were now useless. He despaired of living any longer. He was getting weaker and weaker until at last he had to be asked to perform the necessary functions in bed. But up to the last he refused to do anything of the kind, always insisting on going through the strain of leaving his bed. The Vaishnavite rules about external cleanliness are so inexorable. Such cleanliness is quite essential, no doubt, but Western medical science had taught us that all the functions, including a bath, can be done in bed with the strictest regard to cleanliness and without the slightest discomfort to the patient, the bed always remaining spotlessly clean. I should regard such cleanliness as quite consistent with Vaishnavism. But my father's insistence on leaving the bed only struck me with wonder then, and I had nothing but admiration for it. The dreadful night came. My uncle was then in Rajkot. I have a faint recollection that he came to Rajkot having had news that my father was getting worse. The brothers were deeply attached to each other. My uncle would sit near my father's bed the whole day and would insist on sleeping by his bedside after sending us all to sleep. No one had dreamt that this was to be the fateful night. The danger, of course, was there. It was 10:30 or 11 p.m. I was giving the massage. My uncle offered to relieve me. I was glad and went straight to the bedroom. My wife, poor thing, was fast asleep. But how could she sleep when I was there? I woke her up in 5 or 6 minutes. However, the servant knocked at the door. I started with alarm. "Get up," he said, "Father is very ill." I knew, of course, that he was very ill, and so I guessed what very ill meant at that moment. I sprang out of bed. "What is the matter? Do tell me." "Father is no more." So all was over. I had but to wring my hands. I felt deeply ashamed and miserable. I ran to my father's room. I saw that, if animal passion had not blinded me, I should have been spared the torture of separation from my father during his last moments. I should have been massaging him and he would have died in my arms. But now it was my uncle who had this privilege. He was so deeply devoted to his elder brother that he had earned the honor of doing him the last services. My father had forebodings of the coming event. He had made a sign for pen and paper and written, "Prepare for the last rites." He had then snapped the amulet off his arm and also his gold necklace of tulsi beads and flung them aside. A moment after this he was no more. The shame, to which I have referred in a foregoing chapter, was this of my carnal desire even at the critical hour of my father's death, which demanded wakeful service. It is a blot I have never been able to efface or forget, and I have always thought that, although my devotion to my parents knew no bounds and I would have given up anything for it, yet I was weighed and found unpardonably wanting because my mind was at the same moment in the grip of lust. I have therefore always regarded myself as a lustful, though a faithful husband. It took me long to get free from the shackles of lust, and I had to pass through many ordeals before I could overcome it. Before I close this chapter of my double shame, I may mention that the poor mite that was born to my wife scarcely breathed for more than 3 or 4 days. Nothing else could be expected. Let all those who are married be warned by my example. Chapter 10. Glimpses of Religion. From my 6th or 7th year up to my 16th, I was at school, being taught all sorts of things except religion. I may say that I failed to get from the teachers what they could have given me without any effort on their part. And yet I kept on picking up things here and there from my surroundings. The term religion I am using in its broadest sense, meaning thereby self-realization or knowledge of self. Being born in the Vaishnava faith, I has often to go to the Haveli. But it never appealed to me. I did not like its glitter and pomp. Also, I heard rumors of immorality being practiced there and lost all interest in it. Hence I could gain nothing from the Haveli. But what I failed to get there I obtained from my nurse, an old servant of the family whose affection for me I still recall. I have said before that there was in me a fear of ghosts and spirits. Rumba, for that was her name, suggested, as a remedy for this fear, the repetition of Ramanama. I had more faith in her than in her remedy, and so at a tender age I began repeating Ramanama to cure my fear of ghosts and spirits. This was of course short-lived, but the good seed sown in childhood was not sown in vain. I think it is due to the seed by that good woman Rumba that today Ramanama is an infallible remedy for me. Just about this time, a cousin of mine who was a devotee of the Ramayana arranged for my second brother and me to learn Ram Raksha. We got it by heart and made it a rule to recite it every morning after the bath. The practice was kept up as long as we were in Porbandar. As soon as we reached Rajkot, it was forgotten, for I had not much belief in it. I recited it partly because of my pride in being able to recite Ram Raksha with correct pronunciation. What, however, left a deep impression on me was the reading of the Ramayana before my father. During part of his illness my father was in Porbandar. There every evening he used to listen to the Ramayana. The reader was a great devotee of Rama, Lata Maharaj of Bileshwar. It was said of him that he cured himself of his leprosy not by any medicine, but by applying to the affected parts bilva leaves which had been cast away after being offered to the image of Mahadeva in Bileshwar temple, and by the regular repetition of Ramanama. His faith, it was said, had made him whole. This may or may not be true. We at any rate believe the story. And it is a fact that when Lata Maharaj began his reading of the Ramayana, his body was entirely free from leprosy. He had a melodious voice. He would sing the dohas, couplets, and chapes, quatrains, and explain them. losing himself in the discourse and carrying his listeners along with him. I must have been 13 at that time, but I quite remember being enraptured by his reading. That laid the foundation of my deep devotion to the Ramayana. Today I regard the Ramayana of Tulsidas as the greatest book in all devotional literature. A few months after this we came to Rajkot. There was no Ramayana reading there. The Bhagavad, however, used to be read on every Ekadashi day. Sometimes I attended the reading, but the reciter was uninspiring. Today I see that the Bhagavad is a book which can evoke religious fervor. I have read it in Gujarati with intense interest, but when I heard portions of the original, read by Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya during my 21 days fast, I wished I had heard it in my childhood from such a devote as he is, so that I could have formed a liking for it at an early age. Impressions formed at that age strike roots deep down into one's nature, and it is my perpetual regret that I was not fortunate enough to hear more good books of this kind read during that period. In Rajkot, however, I got an early grounding in toleration for all branches of Hinduism and sister religions. For my father and mother would visit the Haveli as also Shiva's and Rama's temples, and would take or send us youngsters there. Jain monks also would pay frequent visits to my father, and would even go out of their way to accept food from us non-Jains. They would have talks with my father on subjects religious and mundane. He had, besides, Musalman and Parsi friends who would talk to him about their own faiths, and he would listen to them always with respect and often with interest. Being his nurse, I often had a chance to be present at these talks. These many things combined to inculcate in me a toleration for all faiths. Only Christianity was at the time an exception. I developed a sort of dislike for it, and for a reason. In those days, Christian missionaries used to stand in a corner near the high school and hold forth, pouring abuse on Hindus and their gods. I could not endure this. I must have stood there to hear them once only, but that was enough to dissuade me from repeating the experiment. About the same time, I heard of a well-known Hindu having been converted to Christianity. It was the talk of the town that, when he was baptized, he had to eat beef and drink liquor, that he also had to change his clothes, and that thenceforth he began to go about in European costume, including a hat. These things got on my nerves. Surely, thought I, a religion that compelled one to eat beef, drink liquor, and change one's own clothes did not deserve the name. I also heard that the new convert had already begun abusing the religion of his ancestors, their customs and their country. All these things created in me a dislike for Christianity. But the fact that I had learned to be tolerant to other religions did not mean that I had any living faith in God. I happened, about this time, to come across Manusmriti, which was amongst my father's collection. The story of the creation and similar things in it did not impress me very much, but on the contrary made me incline somewhat towards atheism. There was a cousin of mine, still alive, for whose intellect I had great regard. To him I turned with my doubts, but he could not resolve them. He sent me away with this answer: when you grow up, you will be able to solve these doubts yourself. These questions ought not to be raised at your age. I was silenced, but was not comforted. Chapters about diet and the like in Manusmriti seemed to me to run contrary to daily practice. To my doubts as to this also, I got the same answer: with intellect more developed and with more reading I shall understand it better, I said to myself. Manusmriti at any rate did not then teach me ahimsa. I have told the story of my meat-eating. Manusmriti seemed to support it. I also felt that it was quite moral to kill serpents, bugs and the like. I remember to have killed at that age bugs and such other insects, regarding it as a duty. But one thing took deep root in me: the conviction that morality is the basis of things, and that truth is the substance of all morality. Truth became my sole objective. It began to grow in magnitude. Every day, and my definition of it also has been ever widening. A Gujarati didactic stanza likewise gripped my mind and heart. Its precept return good for evil became my guiding principle. It became such a passion with me that I began numerous experiments in it. Here are those for me. Wonderful lines. For a bowl of water give a goodly meal, for a kindly greeting bow thou down with zeal, for a simple penny pay thou back with gold, if thy life be rescued, life do not withhold. Thus, the words and actions of the wise regard, every little service tenfold they reward. But the truly noble know all men as one, and return with gladness good for evil done. Chapter 11. Preparation for England. I passed the matriculation examination in 1887. It then used to be held at two centers, Ahmedabad and Bombay. The general poverty of the country naturally led Kathiawad students to prefer the nearer and the cheaper center. The poverty of my family likewise dictated to me the same choice. This was my first journey from Rajkot to Ahmedabad, and that too without a companion. My elders wanted me to pursue my studies at college after the matriculation. There was a college in Bhavnagar as well as in Bombay, and as the former was cheaper, I decided to go there and join the Samaldas College. I went, but found myself entirely at sea. Everything was difficult. I could not follow, let alone taking interest in, the professors' lectures. It was no fault of theirs. The professors in that college were regarded as first-rate. But I was so raw. At the end of the first term, I returned home. We had in Mavji Dave, who was a shrewd and learned Brahmin, an old friend and advisor of the family. He had kept up his connection with the family even after my father's death. He happened to visit us during my vacation. In conversation with my mother and elder brother, he inquired about my studies. Learning that I was at Samaldas College, he said, "The times are changed, and none of you can expect to succeed to your father's Gadi without having a proper education. Now, as this boy is still pursuing his studies, you should all look to him to keep the Gadi. It will take him 4 or 5 years to get his BA degree, which will at best qualify him for a 60 rupees post, not for a diwanship. If like my son he went in for law, it would take him still longer, by which time there would be a host of lawyers aspiring for a diwan's post. I would far rather that you send him to England. My son Kavalram says it is very easy to become a barrister. In 3 years' time he will return. Also expenses will not exceed 4 to 5,000 rupees. Think of that barrister who has just come back from England. How stylishly he lives. He could get the diwanship for the asking. I would strongly advise you to send Mohandas to England this very year. Kavalram has numerous friends in England. He will give notes of introduction to them, and Mohandas will have an easy time of it there. Joshaji, that is how we used to call old Mavji Dave, turned to me with complete assurance and asked, "Would you not rather go to England than study here?" Nothing could have been more welcome to me. I was fighting shy of my difficult studies. So I jumped at the proposal and said that the sooner I was sent the better. It was no easy business to pass examinations quickly. Could I not be sent to qualify for the medical profession? My brother interrupted me. Father never liked it. He had you in mind when he said that we Vaishnavas should have nothing to do with dissection of dead bodies. Father intended you for the bar. Joshaji chimed in, "I am not opposed to the medical profession, as was Gandhiji. Our Shastras are not against it. But a medical degree will not make a Diwan of you, and I want you to be Diwan or, if possible, something better. Only in that way could you take under your protecting care your large family. The times are fast changing and getting harder every day. It is the wisest thing, therefore, to become a barrister." Turning to my mother, he said, "Now, I must leave. Pray ponder over what I have said. When I come here next, I shall expect to hear of preparations for England." Be sure to let me know if I can assist in any way. Joshaji went away, and I began building castles in the air. My elder brother was greatly exercised in his mind. How was he to find the wherewithal to send me? And was it proper to trust a young man like me to go abroad alone? My mother was sorely perplexed. She did not like the idea of parting with me. This is how she tried to put me off. Uncle, she said, is now the eldest member of the family. He should first be consulted. If he consents, we will consider the matter. My brother had another idea. He said to me, we have a certain claim on the Porbandar state. Mr. Laley is the administrator. He thinks highly of our family, and uncle is in his good books. It is just possible that he might recommend you for some state help for your education in England. I liked all this and got ready to start off for Porbandar. There was no railway in those days. It was a 5 days bullock cart journey. I have already said that I was a coward. But at that moment my cowardice vanished before the desire to go to England, which completely possessed me. I hired a bullock cart as far as Daraji, and from Daraji I took a camel in order to get to Porbandar a day quicker. This was my first camel ride. I arrived at last, did obeisance to my uncle, and told him everything. He thought it over and said, I am not sure whether it is possible for one to stay in England without prejudice to one's own religion. From all I have heard, I have my doubts. When I meet these big barristers, I see no difference between their life and that of Europeans. They know no scruples regarding food. Cigars are never out of their mouths. They dress as shamelessly as Englishmen. All that would not be in keeping with our family tradition. I am shortly going on a pilgrimage and have not many years to live. At the threshold of death, how dare I give you permission to go to England, to cross the seas? But I will not stand in your way. It is your mother's permission which really matters. If she permits you, then Godspeed. Tell her I will not interfere. You will go with my blessings. I could expect nothing more from you, said I. I shall now try to win mother over. But would you not recommend me to Mr. Laley? How can I do that, said he. But he is a good man. You ask for an appointment telling him how you are connected. He will certainly give you one and may even help you. I cannot say why my uncle did not give me a note of recommendation. I have a faint idea that he hesitated to cooperate directly in my going to England, which was in his opinion an irreligious act. I wrote to Mr. Laley, who asked me to see him at his residence. He saw me as he was ascending the staircase, and saying curtly, pass your BA fist and then see me. No help can be given you. Now he hurried upstairs. I had made elaborate preparations to meet him. I had carefully learned up a few sentences and had bowed low and saluted him with both hands. But all to no purpose. I thought of my wife's ornaments. I thought of my elder brother, in whom I had the utmost faith. He was generous to a fault, and he loved me as his son. I returned to Rajkot from Porbandar and reported all that had happened. I consulted Joshaji, who, of course, advised even incurring a debt if necessary. I suggested the disposal of my wife's ornaments, which could fetch about 2,000 or 3,000 rupees. My brother promised to find the money somehow. My mother, however, was still unwilling. She had begun making minute inquiries. Someone had told her that young men got lost in England. Someone else had said that they took to meat, and yet another that they could not live there without liquor. How about all this, she asked me. I said, will you not trust me? I shall not lie to you. I swear that I shall not touch any of those things. If there were any such danger, would Joshaji let me go? I can trust you, she said, but how can I trust you in a distant land? I am dazed and know not what to do. I will ask Bicharji Swami. Bicharji Swami was originally a Madhbania, but had now become a Jain monk. He too was a family advisor like Joshaji. He came to my help and said, "I shall get the boy solemnly to take the 3 vows, and then he can be allowed to go." He administered the oath, and I vowed not to touch wine, woman, and meat. This done, my mother gave her permission. The high school had a send-off in my honor. It was an uncommon thing for a young man of Rajkot to go to England. I had written out a few words of thanks, but I could scarcely stammer them out. I remember how my head reeled and how my whole frame shook as I stood up to read them. With the blessing of my elders, I started for Bombay. This was my first journey from Rajkot to Bombay. My brother accompanied me. But there is many a slip twixt the cup and the lip. There were difficulties to be faced in Bombay. Chapter 12. Outcast. With my mother's permission and blessings, I set off exultantly for Bombay, leaving my wife with a baby of a few months. But on arrival, their friends told my brother that the Indian Ocean was rough in June and July, and as this was my first voyage, I should not be allowed to sail until November. Someone also reported that a steamer had just been sunk in a gale. This made my brother uneasy, and he refused to take the risk of allowing me to sail immediately. Leaving me with a friend in Bombay, he returned to Rajkot to resume his duty. He put the money for my traveling expenses in the keeping of a brother-in-law and left word with some friends to give me whatever help I might need. Time hung heavily on my hands in Bombay. I dreamt continually of going to England. Meanwhile, my caste people were agitated over my going abroad. No Madbania had been to England up to now, and if I dared to do so, I ought to be brought to book. A general meeting of the caste was called, and I was summoned to appear before it. I went. Now I suddenly managed to muster up courage I do not know. Nothing daunted, and without the slightest hesitation, I came before the meeting. The Sheth, the headman of the community, who was distantly related to me and had been on very good terms with my father, thus accosted me. "In the opinion of the caste, your proposal to go to England is not proper. Our religion forbids voyage abroad. We have also heard that it is not possible to live there without compromising out religion. One is obliged to eat and drink with Europeans." To which I replied, "I do not think it is at all against our religion to go to England. I intend going there for further studies, and I have already solemnly promised to my mother to abstain from 3 things you fear most. I am sure the vow will keep me safe. But we tell you," rejoined the Sheth, "that it is not possible to keep our religion there. You know my relations with your father, and you ought to listen to my advice." "I know those relations," said I, "and you are as an elder to me. But I am helpless in this matter. I cannot alter my resolve to go to England. My father's friend and advisor, who is a learned Brahmin, sees no objection to my going to England, and my mother and brother have also given me their permission. But will you disregard the orders of the caste? I am really helpless. I think the caste should not interfere in the matter." This incensed the Sheth. He swore at me. He said unmoved. So the Sheth pronounced his order. "This boy shall be treated as an outcast from today. Whoever helps him or goes to see him off at the dock shall be punishable with a fine of 1 rupee 4 annas." The order had no effect on me, and I took my leave of the Sheth. But I wondered how my brother would take it. Fortunately, he remained firm and wrote to assure me that I had his permission to go, the Sheth's order notwithstanding. The incident, however, made me more anxious than ever to sail. What would happen if they succeeded in bringing pressure to bear on my brother? Supposing something unforeseen happened? As I was thus worrying over my predicament, I heard that a Junagadh vakil was going to England for being called to the bar by a boat sailing on the 4th of September. I met the friends to whose care my brother had commended me. They also agreed that I should not let go the opportunity of going in such company. There was no time to be lost. I wired to my brother for permission, which he granted. I asked my brother-in-law to give me the money, but he referred to the order of the chef and said that he could not afford to lose caste. I then sought a friend of the family and requested him to accommodate me to the extent of my passage and sundries and to recover the loan from my brother. The friend was not only good enough to accede to my request, but he cheered me up as well. I was so thankful. With part of the money I at once purchased the passage. Then I had to equip myself for the voyage. There was another friend who had experience in the matter. He got clothes and other things ready. Some of the clothes I liked and some I did not like at all. The necktie, which I delighted in wearing later, I then abhorred. The short jacket I looked upon as immodest. But this dislike was nothing before the desire to go to England, which was uppermost in me. Of provisions also I had enough and to spare for the voyage. A berth was reserved for me by my friends in the same cabin as that of SJT, Triambakrai. Masmuter, the Junagadh Vakil. They also commended me to him. He was an experienced man, of mature age and knew the world. I was yet a stripling of 18 without any experience of the world. SJT, Masmuter told my friends not to worry about me. I sailed at last from Bombay on the 4th of September. Chapter 13. In London at last. I did not feel at all seasick. But as the days passed, I became fidgety. I felt shy even in speaking to the steward. I was quite unaccustomed to talking English, and except for SJT Masmuter, all the other passengers in the second saloon were English. I could not speak to them, for I could rarely follow their remarks when they came up to speak to me, and even when I understood, I could not reply. I had to frame every sentence in my mind before I could bring it out. I was innocent of the use of knives and forks and had not the boldness to inquire what dishes on the menu were free of meat. I therefore never took meals at table but always had them in my cabin, and they consisted principally of sweets and fruits which I had brought with me. SJT Masmuter had no difficulty, and he mixed with everybody. He would move about freely on deck, while I hid myself in the cabin the whole day, only venturing up on deck when there were but few people. SJT Masmuter kept pleading with me to associate with the passengers and to talk with them freely. He told me that lawyers should have a long tongue and related to me his legal experiences. He advised me to take every possible opportunity of talking English and not to mind making mistakes which were obviously unavoidable with a foreign tongue. But nothing could make me conquer my shyness. An English passenger, taking kindly to me, drew me into conversation. He was older than I. He asked me what I ate, what I was, where I was going, why I was shy, and so on. He also advised me to come to table. He laughed at my insistence on abjuring meat and said in a friendly way, "When we were in the Red Sea, it is all very well so far, but you will have to revise your decision in the Bay of Biscay. And it is so cold in England that one cannot possibly live there without meat." "But I have heard that people can live there without eating meat," I said. "Rest assured it is a fib," said he. "No one, to my knowledge, lives there without being a meat eater. Don't you see that I am not asking you to take liquor, though I do so? But I do think you should eat meat, for you cannot live without it. I thank you for your kind advice, but I have solemnly promised to my mother not to touch meat, and therefore I cannot think of taking it. If it be found impossible to get on without it, I will far rather go back to India than eat meat in order to remain there." We entered the Bay of Biscay, but I did not begin to feel the need either of meat or liquor. I had been advised to collect certificates of my having abstained from meat, and I asked the English friend to give me one. He gladly gave it, and I treasured it for some time. But when I saw later that one could get such a certificate in spite of being a meat eater, it lost all its charm for me. If my word was not to be trusted, where was the use of possessing a certificate in the matter? However, we reached Southampton, as far as I remember, on a Saturday. On the boat I had worn a black suit, the white flannel one, which my friends had got me, having been kept especially for wearing when I landed. I had thought that white clothes would suit me better when I stepped ashore, and therefore I did so in white flannels. Those were the last days of September, and I found I was the only person wearing such clothes. I left in charge of an agent of Grinley and Company all my kit, including the keys, seeing that many others had done the same and I must follow suit. I had 4 notes of introduction, to Dr. P. J. Mehta, to S.J.T. Dalpatram Shukla, to Prince Ranjit Singhji, and to Dadabhai Naoroji. Someone on board had advised us to put up at the Victoria Hotel in London. S.J.T. Masmuder and I accordingly went there. The shame of being the only person in white clothes was already too much for me. And when at the hotel I was told that I should not get my things from Grinley's the next day, it being a Sunday, I was exasperated. Dr. Mehta, to whom I had wired from Southampton, called at about 8 o'clock the same evening. He gave me a hearty greeting. He smiled at my being in flannels. As we were talking, I casually picked up his top hat and, trying to see how smooth it was, passed my hand over it the wrong way and disturbed the fur. Dr. Mehta looked somewhat angrily at what I was doing and stopped me. But the mischief had been done. The incident was a warning for the future. This was my first lesson in European etiquette, into the details of which Dr. Mehta humorously initiated me. Do not touch other people's things, he said. Do not ask questions as we usually do in India on first acquaintance. Do not talk loudly. Never address people as sir whilst speaking to them as we do in India. Only servants and subordinates address their masters that way, and so on and so forth. He also told me that it was very expensive to live in a hotel and recommended that I should live with a private family. We deferred consideration of the matter until Monday. S.J.T. Masmuder and I found the hotel to be a trying affair. It was also very expensive. There was, however, a Sindhi fellow passenger from Malta who had become friends with S.J.T. Masmuder, and as he was not a stranger to London, he offered to find rooms for us. We agreed, and on Monday, as soon as we got our baggage, we paid up our bills and went to the rooms rented for us by the Sindhi friend. I remember my hotel bill came to £3, an amount which shocked me. And I had practically starved in spite of this heavy bill, for I could relish nothing. When I did not like one thing, I asked for another, but had to pay for both just the same. The fact is that all this while I had depended on the provisions which I had brought with me from Bombay. I was very uneasy even in the new rooms. I would continually think of my home and country. My mother's love always haunted me. At night the tears would stream down my cheeks, and home memories of all sorts made sleep out of the question. It was impossible to share my misery with anyone. And even if I could have done so, where was the use? I knew of nothing that would soothe me. Everything was strange, the people, their ways, and even their dwellings. I was a complete novice in the matter of English etiquette and continually had to be on my guard. There was the additional inconvenience of the vegetarian vow. Even the dishes that I could eat were tasteless and insipid. I thus found myself between Scylla and Charybdis. England I could not bear, but to return to India was not to be thought of. Now that I had come, I must finish the 3 years, said the inner voice. Chapter 14. My choice. Dr. Mehta went on Monday to the Victoria Hotel expecting to find me there. He discovered that we had left, got our new address, and met me at our rooms. Through sheer folly I had managed to get ringworm on the boat. For washing and bathing we used to have sea water, in which soap is not soluble. I, however, used soap, taking its use to be a sign of civilization, with the result that instead of cleaning the skin it made it greasy. This gave me ringworm. I showed it to Dr. Mehta, who told me to apply acetic acid. I remember how the burning acid made me cry. Dr. Mehta inspected my room and its appointments and shook his head in disapproval. "This place won't do," he said. "We come to England not so much for the purpose of studies as for gaining experience of English life and customs. And for this you need to live with a family. But before you do so, I think you had better serve a period of apprenticeship with Dash. I will take you there." I gratefully accepted the suggestion and removed to the friend's rooms. He was all kindness and attention. He treated me as his own brother, initiated me into English ways and manners, and accustomed me to talking the language. My food, however, became a serious question. I could not relish boiled vegetables cooked without salt or condiments. The landlady was at a loss to know what to prepare for me. We had oatmeal porridge for breakfast, which was fairly filling, but I always starved at lunch and dinner. The friend continually reasoned with me to eat meat, but I always pleaded my vow and then remained silent. Both for luncheon and dinner we had spinach and bread and jam too. I was a good eater and had a capacious stomach, but I was ashamed to ask for more than 2 or 3 slices of bread, as it did not seem correct to do so. Added to this, there was no milk either for lunch or dinner. The friend once got disgusted with this state of things and said, "Had you been my own brother, I would have sent you packing." What is the value of a vow made before an illiterate mother and in ignorance of conditions here? It is no vow at all. It would not be regarded as a vow in law. It is pure superstition to stick to such a promise. And I tell you, this persistence will not help you to gain anything here. You confess to having eaten and relished men. You took it where it was absolutely unnecessary, and will not where it is quite essential. What a pity! But I was adamant. Day in and day out the friend would argue, but I had an eternal negative to face him with. The more he argued, the more uncompromising I became. Daily I would pray for God's protection and get it. Not that I had any idea of God. It was faith that was at work, faith of which the seed had been sown by the good nurse Rumba. One day the friend began to read to me Bentham's theory of utility. I was at my wit's end. The language was too difficult for me to understand. He began to expound it. I said, "Pray excuse me. These abstruse things are beyond me. I admit it is necessary to eat meat. But I cannot break my vow. I cannot argue about it. I am sure I cannot meet you in argument. But please give me up as foolish or obstinate. I appreciate your love for me, and I know you to be my well-wisher. I also know that you are telling me again and again about this because you feel for me. But I am helpless. A vow is a vow. It cannot be broken." The friend looked at me in surprise. He closed the book and said, "All right. I will not argue any more." I was glad. He never discussed the subject again. But he did not cease to worry about me. He smoked and drank, but he never asked me to do so. In fact, he asked me to remain away from both. His one anxiety was lest I should become very weak without meat and thus be unable to feel at home in England. That is how I served my apprenticeship for a month. The friend's house was in Richmond, and it was not possible to go to London more than once or twice a week. Dr. Mehta and SJT, Dalparam Shukla therefore decided that I should be put with some family. SJT Shukla hit upon an Anglo-Indian's house in West Kensington and placed me there. The landlady was a widow. I told her about my vow. The old lady promised to look after me properly, and I took up my residence in her house. Here too I practically had to starve. I had sent for sweets and other eatables from home, but nothing had yet come. Everything was insipid. Every day the old lady asked me whether I liked the food, but what could she do? I was still as shy as ever and dared not ask for more than was put before me. She had 2 daughters. They insisted on serving me with an extra slice or 2 of bread. But little did they know that nothing less than a loaf would have filled me. But I had found my feet now. I had not yet started upon my regular studies. I had just begun reading newspapers, thanks to S.J.T. Shukla. In India I had never read a newspaper. But here I succeeded in cultivating a liking for them by regular reading. I always glanced over the Daily News, the Daily Telegraph, and the Pall Mall Gazette. This took me hardly an hour. I therefore began to wander about. I launched out in search of a vegetarian restaurant. The landlady had told me that there were such places in the city. I would trot 10 or 12 miles each day, go into a cheap restaurant and eat my fill of bread, but would never be satisfied. During these wanderings I once hit on a vegetarian restaurant in Farringdon Street. The sight of it filled me with the same joy that a child feels on getting a thing after its own heart. Before I entered I noticed books for sale, exhibited under a glass window near the door. I saw among them Salt's Plea for Vegetarianism. This I purchased for $1 and went straight to the dining room. This was my first hearty meal since my arrival in England. God had come to my aid. I read Salt's book from cover to cover and was very much impressed by it. From the date of reading this book, I may claim to have become a vegetarian by choice. I blessed the day on which I had taken the vow before my mother. I had all along abstained from meat in the interests of truth and of the vow I had taken, but had wished at the same time that every Indian should be a meat eater, and had looked forward to being one myself freely and openly someday, and to enlisting others in the cause. The choice was now made in favor of vegetarianism, the spread of which henceforward became my mission. Chapter 15. Playing the English Gentleman. My faith in vegetarianism grew on me from day to day. Salt's book whetted my appetite for dietetic studies. I went in for all books available on vegetarianism and read them. One of these, Howard Williams' The Ethics of Diet, was biographical history of the literature of humane dietetics. From the earliest period to the present day, it tried to make out that all philosophers and prophets, from Pythagoras and Jesus down to those of the present age, were vegetarians. Dr. Anna Kingsford's The Perfect Way in Diet was also an attractive book. Dr. Allinson's writings on health and hygiene were likewise very helpful. He advocated a curative system based on regulation of the dietary of patients. Himself a vegetarian, he prescribed for his patients also a strictly vegetarian diet. The result of reading all this literature was that dietetic experiments came to take an important place in my life. Health was the principal consideration of these experiments to begin with, but later on religion became the supreme motive. Meanwhile, my friend had not ceased to worry about me. His love for me led him to think that if I persisted in my objections to meat eating, I should not only develop a weak constitution, but should remain a duffer, because I should never feel at home in English society. When he came to know that I had begun to interest myself in books on vegetarianism, he was afraid lest these studies should muddle my head, that I should fritter my life away in experiments, forgetting my own work, and become a crank. He therefore made one last effort to reform me. He one day invited me to go to the theater. Before the play we were to dine together at the Holborn restaurant, to me a palatial place and the first big restaurant I had been to since leaving the Victoria Hotel. The stay at that hotel had scarcely been a helpful experience, for I had not lived there with my wits about me. The friend had planned to take me to this restaurant evidently, imagining that modesty would forbid any questions. And it was a very big company of diners in the midst of which my friend and I sat sharing a table between us. The first course was soup. I wondered what it might be made of, but durst not ask the friend about it. I therefore summoned the waiter. My friend saw the movement and sternly asked across the table what was the matter. With considerable hesitation I told him that I wanted to inquire if the soup was a vegetable soup. "You are too clumsy for decent society," he passionately exclaimed, "if you cannot behave yourself. You had better go. Feed in some other restaurant and await me outside." This delighted me. Out I went. There was a vegetarian restaurant close by, but it was closed. So I went without food that night. I accompanied my friend to the theater, but he never said a word about the scene I had created. On my part, of course, there was nothing to say. That was the last friendly tussle we had. It did not affect our relations in the least. I could see and appreciate the love by which all my friend's efforts were actuated, and my respect for him was all the greater on account of our differences in thought and action. But I decided that I should put him at ease, that I should assure him that I would be clumsy no more, but try to become polished and make up for my vegetarianism by cultivating other accomplishments which fitted one for polite society. And for this purpose I undertook the all too impossible task of becoming an English gentleman. The clothes after the Bombay cut that I was wearing were, I thought, unsuitable for English society, and I got new ones at the Army and Navy stores. I also went in for a chimney pot hat, costing 19 shillings, an excessive price in those days. Not content with this, I wasted £10 on an evening suit made in Bond Street, the center of fashionable life in London, and got my good and noble-hearted brother to send me a double watch chain of gold. It was not correct to wear a ready-made tie, and I learnt the art of tying one for myself. While in India, the mirror had been a luxury permitted on the days when the family barber gave me a shave. Here I wasted 10 minutes every day before a huge mirror, watching myself arranging my tie and parting my hair in the correct fashion. My hair was by no means soft, and every day it meant a regular struggle with the brush to keep it in position. Each time the hat was put on and off, the hand would automatically move towards the head to adjust the hair, not to mention the other civilized habit of the hand every now and then operating for the same purpose when sitting in polished society. As if all this were not enough to make me look the thing, I directed my attention to other details that were supposed to go towards the making of an English gentleman. I was told it was necessary for me to take lessons in dancing, French, and elocution. French was not only the language of neighboring France, but it was the lingua franca of the continent over which I had a desire to travel. I decided to take dancing lessons at a class and paid down £3 as fees for a term. I must have taken about 6 lessons in 3 weeks. But it was beyond me to achieve anything like rhythmic motion. I could not follow the piano, and hence found it impossible to keep time. What then was I to do? The recluse in the fable kept a cat to keep off the rats, and then a cow to feed the cat with milk, and a man to keep the cow, and so on. My ambitions also grew like the family of the recluse. I thought I should learn to play the violin in order to cultivate an ear for Western music. So I invested £3 in a violin and something more in fees. I sought a third teacher to give me lessons in elocution and paid him a preliminary fee of £1. He recommended Bell's Standard Elocutionist as the textbook, which I purchased. And I began with a speech of Pitt's. But Mr. Bell rang the bell of alarm in my ear, and I awoke. I had not to spend a lifetime in England, I said to myself. What then was the use of learning elocution? And how could dancing make a gentleman of me? The violin I could learn even in India. I was a student and ought to go on with my studies. I should qualify myself to join the inns of court. If my character made a gentleman of me, so much the better. Otherwise I should forego the ambition. These and similar thoughts possessed me, and I expressed them in a letter which I addressed to the elocution teacher, requesting him to excuse me from further lessons. I had taken only 2 or 3. I wrote a similar letter to the dancing teacher, and went personally to the violin teacher with a request to dispose of the violin for any price it might fetch. She was rather friendly to me, so I told her how I had discovered that I was pursuing a false idea. She encouraged me in the determination to make a complete change. This infatuation must have lasted about 3 months. The punctiliousness in dress persisted for years. But henceforward I became a student. Chapter 16. Changes. Let no one imagine that my experiments in dancing and the like marked a stage of indulgence in my life. The reader will have noticed that even then I had my wits about me. That period of infatuation was not unrelieved by a certain amount of self-introspection on my part. I kept account of every farthing I spent, and my expenses were carefully calculated. Every little item, such as omnibus fares or postage or a couple of coppers spent on newspapers, would be entered, and the balance struck every evening before going to bed. That habit has stayed with me ever since. And I know that as a result, though I have had to handle public funds amounting to lakhs, I have succeeded in exercising strict economy in their disbursement, and instead of outstanding debts, have had invariably a surplus balance in respect of all the movements I have led. Let every youth take a leaf out of my book and make it a point to account for everything that comes into and goes out of his pocket, and like me he is sure to be a gainer in the end. As I kept strict watch over my way of living, I could see that it was necessary to economize. I therefore decided to reduce my expenses by half. My accounts showed numerous items spent on fares. Again, my living with a family meant the payment of a regular weekly bill. It also included the courtesy of occasionally taking members of the family out to dinner and likewise attending parties with them. All this involved heavy items for conveyances, especially as, if the friend was a lady, custom required that the man should pay all the expenses. Also, dining out meant extra cost, as no deduction could be made from the regular weekly bill for meals not taken. It seemed to me that all these items could be saved, as likewise the drain on my purse through a false sense of propriety. So I decided to take rooms on my own account, instead of living any longer in a family, and also to remove from place to place according to the work I had to do, thus gaining experience at the same time. The rooms were so selected as to enable me to reach the place of business on foot in half an hour, and so save fares. Before this I had always taken some kind of conveyance whenever I went anywhere and had to find extra time for walks. The new arrangement combined walks and economy, as it meant a saving of fares and gave me walks of 8 or 10 miles a day. It was mainly this habit of long walks that kept me practically free from illness throughout my stay in England and gave me a fairly strong body. Thus I rented a suite of rooms, one for a sitting room and another for a bedroom. This was the second stage. The third was yet to come. These changes saved me half the expense. But how was I to utilize the time? I knew that bar examinations did not require much study, and I therefore did not feel pressed for time. My weak English was a perpetual worry to me. Mr. afterwards Sir Frederick Lely's words, graduate first, and then come to me, still rang in my ears. I should, I thought, not only be called to the bar, but have some literary degree as well. I inquired about the Oxford and Cambridge University courses, consulted a few friends, and found that, if I elected to go to either of these places, that would mean greater expense and a much longer stay in England than I was prepared for. A friend suggested that, if I really wanted to have the satisfaction of taking a difficult examination, I should pass the London matriculation. It meant a good deal of labor and much addition to my stock of general knowledge, without any extra expense worth the name. I welcomed the suggestion, but the syllabus frightened me. Latin and a modern language were compulsory. How was I to manage Latin? But the friend entered a strong plea for it. Latin is very valuable to lawyers. Knowledge of Latin is very useful in understanding law books. And one paper in Roman law is entirely in Latin. Besides, a knowledge of Latin means greater command over the English language. It went home and I decided to learn Latin, no matter how difficult it might be. French I had already begun, so I thought that should be the modern language. I joined a private matriculation class. Examinations were held every 6 months and I had only 5 months at my disposal. It was an almost impossible task for me. But the aspirant, after being an English gentleman, chose to convert himself into a serious student. I framed my own timetable to the minute, but neither my intelligence nor memory promised to enable me to tackle Latin and French, besides other subjects within the given period. The result was that I was plowed in Latin. I was sorry but did not lose heart. I had acquired a taste for Latin, also I thought my French would be all the better for another trial, and I would select a new subject in the science group. Chemistry, which was my subject in science, had no attraction for want of experiments, whereas it ought to have been a deeply interesting study. It was one of the compulsory subjects in India, and so I had selected it for the London matriculation. This time, however, I chose heat and light instead of chemistry. It was said to be easy and I found it to be so.